Well, archaeology is a very fascinating field, and what makes it even more fascinating for people like us is the depth of resources that is out there in archaeology that goes on to validate the veracity of the biblical claims. Now, if you're looking for some very insightful and swift insights into what's happening with modern archaeology, stick around for the rest of the podcast. Well, welcome back to SAFT Podcast, and I'm so excited to have you here all joining us once again. And if this is your first time listening or watching the podcast, make sure to subscribe. We've got some amazing content rolling out for you. And if you use platforms like Apple Podcasts, do review our work there. It's going to be a great form of encouragement for us. And joining me today is Ted Wright. Ted, welcome to SAFT Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jacob.
So let me just go ahead and give you a quick introduction to who Ted is. Ted has a phenomenal resume. He currently serves as the founder and executive director of Epic Archaeology.org. I'm going to link that in the description. Do check them out. And he has a BA in anthropology and archaeology and a MA degree in Christian apologetics with a concentration in philosophy from SES, Southern Evangelical Seminary, where he served as an adjunct professor and as a graduate research assistant to Dr. Norman Geisler. I mean, look at this guy. He was also the former executive and teaching director. This was a huge surprise. Teaching director of crossexamine.org, Frank Turek's ministry. And Frank is no stranger to SAFT Apologetics and our audience. He has also appeared on History Channel and on CNN as part of various documentaries and miniseries. And his most recent appearance is on SAFT Podcast. So Ted, that is, like I said, a phenomenal resume that you've got there.
Thank you. It's definitely the grace of God. That's all I can say.
And I mean, look at Ted. I mean, sorry to the podcast listeners, but for those on YouTube, I mean, look at the set of hair that he has on himself. And Cameron Bertuzzi started off this whole trend of apologists having this glorious hair. Lucas Rodriguez started following suit, and here is Ted as well.
It's part of my argument, Jacob. Is my hair is part of my apologetic. That's hilarious.
All right. So we've got a lot to go through, and you do some phenomenal work at epicarchaeology.org. And
thank you.
I mean, to be frank, in India, archaeology is not a field that normally parents encourage their kids to go into. It's mostly...
Nor is it America either, if you actually want to have a job. I would actually, it's funny, Jacob, I would actually tell my students when I was teaching seminary, I was like, you know, if you go, guys, if you go into archaeology, your career will be in ruins. I mean, you know.
So how did you get into archaeology? I mean, I can see that you have BA in anthropology and archaeology. I mean, that's where it started off, at least to sort of point in. But what made you say, hey, I want to go into this field and spend time digging around?
Yes, that's a great question. And it really kind of, I guess the roots of it all have to do with when growing up as a kid, I was in scouts here in the US. And as a young scout, our leaders would take us to these historical places and battlefields here in the United States. United States Civil War was a very bloody war in the 19th century. And I went to a couple of those battlefields, and it had a big impact on me as a kid. So I really kind of took that with me into my adulthood. And it wasn't until I was in the military, I was getting ready to get out of the military, I was going to get my degree in ancient history. And I had a pastor actually tell me that I should consider archaeology. And he gave me a stack of magazines, Biblical Archaeology Review magazines. So I took those home with me and read through them. And I knew that that's what I wanted to do, because I love the Bible and I love ancient history and I love field work, but I also love academic work as well. So archaeology is sort of the best of both worlds. You can dig in the books and research and do all the academic part of it, but then also you can get out in the field and find the material artifactual remains of whatever it is that you're looking for. So that's kind of what I got into it.
I mean, I know archaeologists are not the Indiana Jones bullwhip cracking type, running away from boulders and stuff, but in the field of archaeology, even if you climb the ranks and, you know, maybe say become the chair of some archaeology department, is it still on table for you to get out there and get in the field and get muddy?
Oh, yes, absolutely, for sure. It's really a blessing living here in Chicago, because I have access to one of the top archaeological institutes in the world. Here in Chicago, we have at the University of Chicago, there's the Oriental Institute, and they've been an archaeological institute for over 100 years, founded by an American archaeologist named James Henry Breasted. And so I get to go, and they actually have lectures on occasion at the OI. And I've actually gotten to meet some really big names in archaeology, Dr. Ian Hodder from the UK, and then Dr. James Osborne here in Chicago, who is basically an archaeologist working in Turkey, who's actually studying the Hittite civilization. So he's a pretty high up academic, but he also gets out on the field as well. So yeah, most practicing archaeologists, when you work yourself up into the academic ranks, you still get out in the field and do the field work, and that's what everybody loves. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I got a pretty good feeling that the audience listening into this part is going to skip over because we're going over nerdy, geeky details, mentioning big names. That's absolutely alien stuff to the audience. So are you working on any current projects that maybe you can share with us?
Yes, absolutely am. So a couple of them are sort of right now in limbo, sort of kind of. One is my team I actually am an associate with the Associates for Biblical Research, ABR, here in the United States. And my colleagues are actually excavating at Shiloh, Tel Shiloh, in Israel. And this is, of course, the place where Joshua and the Israelites, when they came out of the wilderness, they established the capital at Shiloh, and they put the tabernacle there. So our team has been digging there now for several years now, and the director of the excavation is Dr. Scott Stripling, who is a very good friend of mine, and he's actually been on my podcast. And then the other project that I'm working on is a survey project in Turkey, in far eastern Turkey, near the border of Iran, and some really, really fascinating stuff there. I was there in Turkey in 2019 to take part in laying the groundwork for this expedition that we're going to be going on. But right now, everything's kind of on hold because of Turkey, and there's a lot of stuff going on with COVID and some other things. So we're praying that the doors will open up soon and we can get over there and get our work done. But that's the two things that I'm working on right now.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, you can't do archaeology through Zoom, so you gotta wait. So
exactly.
You just released a video on YouTube talking about a recent discovery excavation that has happened in Egypt. Maybe you can touch us on that before we go into the rest of the topics.
Sure. Yes. So it was a really big news item. It broke a few days ago. I'm not sure, when this will come on air, but it's still fairly new in the news media. And it came out of Egypt on the banks of the Nile near Luxor in Thebes in Egypt. And it was announced that the Egyptian authorities had discovered a lost golden city called the Golden City of Aten. And Aten is an Egyptian god associated with the sun. But a couple of things. Yeah, the video that I released, people can go to our YouTube channel and check it out. It's just a really quick, I call it an arrow points video. So it's a really quick little point on an archaeological discovery. But the bottom line is that the city was not lost. It's been known about for several years now. Right. And it really doesn't contain a lot of gold, at least not that we know of. There may be gold discovered in the future, but it does sort of what's so important about this discovery is that it was during the 18th dynasty of Egypt, which is when Egypt was at its height militarily and politically. So and also for some strange reason, a lot of the artifacts that they've uncovered so far were left in place, it's sort of like Pompeii, although it wasn't ash that covered it, it was dirt, but it's like the city was abandoned for some reason, and this stuff, the pottery and the everyday artifacts were actually left behind. So from an archaeological standpoint, it's important because it's going to give us some insights into Egypt at the height of its power. So I have a video on that if you want to check that out. It's called The Lost City of Aten and the Bible.
Right. Okay. So I'll definitely link Epic Archaeology's YouTube channel, and the name of your podcast. It mentions spade in it. I mean, what's the name of your podcast?
Monocle and spade. So it has to do with the old monocle back in the days of old archaeology, where you have the little circle glass on your eye, and the spade has to do with a little shovel, a small archaeologists use. So monocle and spade is sort of a nod to archaeology of the old world.
Right.
And the catchphrase of our podcast is Monocle and Spade, the podcast of Epic Archaeology, where we explore the world of the Bible and beyond through the lens of history and archaeology. So we have that. It's also on YouTube, and we're going to be uploading it on our podcast platform as well. So it's not there yet, but right now it's just on YouTube.
Excellent. All right. So, talking about the field of biblical archaeology, it's a vast field. I mean, we're talking about legends like W.F. Albright, whose institute you're in partnership and connection with. I mean, doing a lots of research. It's a lot going around. But just taking a step back and giving an overview of the entire field to someone who hasn't got much information about biblical archaeology, what is the amount of contribution that the field of archaeology, without having to get into too much of the details, has provided to establishing the claims of biblical accounts?
Yes. So first, let me just explain very quickly what archaeology is and its distinction and its difference than history or historians. So an archaeologist, we study the past through artifacts. And an artifact is anything that's been made or modified by humans. So I think a lot of people mistake archaeologists. They think that, I mean, we are historians, but we're historians who study the past through artifacts. So we do care about historical inscriptions, but our primary goal is to excavate and to find artifacts, to analyze those artifacts, and to try to understand what the ancient world was like through artifacts. Now, that being said, archaeology can function in three ways as it comes to the world of the Bible and apologetics. Right. And I've been teaching this for years. So it's three things. It's really basic. It's the Bible can clarify, the Bible can illuminate, or excuse me, archaeology can clarify, illuminate, and affirm the biblical text. And when I say affirm, I don't mean that it can prove it necessarily, but that it can affirm the historical basis of the scripture. So if the Bible mentions a name or a city or something like that, archaeologists can go and verify if this city did exist. And there have been thousands of things that have been discovered since archaeology has been around that affirm the historical reliability of the text. And that's what epic archaeology is all about. We're all about exploring that affirmation aspect of archaeology. We also like to focus on the clarification and the illumination, because archaeology also gives us insights into how the people that lived in the Bible actually lived thousands of years ago. So it's a very powerful ally. If you're a Christian and you study the scripture, I'm here to tell you, and I've been studying this for over 20 years now, that the archaeology affirms in a major way the stories that you read in your Bible. We find those stories, actually evidence for those stories, in the ground itself. So it's really an exciting field.
Yeah, so maybe you could say that archaeologists are historians, but all historians are not archaeologists.
That's correct. That's right. Historians study the past through primarily written text, whereas archaeologists study the past through artifacts. Now, that's not to say that archaeologists don't care about historical inscriptions and historical text, but our primary motivation, we're sort of materialist in a way, and we look at material artifactual remains, and that's what we focus on. It's not a like black and white thing, because sometimes there's a gray area, because sometimes an archaeologist will find an artifact that actually has writing on it. And a couple of examples, one famous example wasn't found necessarily by an archaeologist, but everybody knows about the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone, of course, is the trilingual inscription that was found by the French in the 1799 by Napoleon Bonaparte's troops. And so it's an artifact, but it has writing on it. So here's a case in which you have an artifact that has actual writing on it. And so it's an interest to both historians and archaeologists. And then also in Israel, there's a site called Tel Lachish, which was mentioned in the scripture in the book of Isaiah and the book of Kings. It's also attested in the Neo-Assyrian records as well. We found that site, we've excavated that site, and there were these pieces of pottery that archaeologists called ostraka, spelled with an O, and the ostraka actually have writing on them, the ancient Hebrew writing. So just like today, we have a piece of paper to write on. Back then, they didn't have paper, but they had pottery, broken pottery. They'd write on these pottery, and so these are known as the Lachish inscriptions. And so there's sort of a crossover sometimes between archaeology and history, but primarily we focus on artifacts.
Yeah, and given that archaeology, I mean, when I look at archaeology, I see that archaeology has a major disadvantage. And maybe you can comment on that. The one thing that I noticed is that you can't just go around and dig up anywhere and anytime. I mean, for example, the Temple Mount, it may have a treasure trove of archaeological importance, but you can't go around and say, I want to dig up Temple Mount. So how does that factor in? I mean, that's a huge setback. You discover and you realize, it leads to a particular place, and that's like a no-go zone. How does that impact modern archaeology? Is that some sort of 3D image scanning technology that you do to to survey the place without actually digging in or something of that sort?
Yes. So there's a couple of things. The disadvantage is for not only that you can't dig anywhere, like as you said, like in the Temple Mount. Sometimes there's legal prohibitions against digging at a certain site. Sometimes there's it's literally dangerous. There's parts of Iraq that are still very dangerous to go dig in, but they're rich archaeologically. But then the other problem is that it's always a money issue. So it's mostly universities and organizations that are excavating in parts of the Near East. And so it's a funding issue, and it's also a personnel issue. So you only have a limited amount of time with a limited amount of people to go actually excavate at a site. But if there is a location that we want to check out, there's certainly things like ground penetrating radar to do surveys. The most recent thing that's been being used in archaeology is something called, it's something that was developed by an Egyptologist here in the United States named Sarah Parchek, and it's called space archaeology. And it's where they actually use satellite imagery to look at and survey sites. So that's one of the aspects of archaeology, is what we call in fact, it's very early in the phase of archaeology. We call it site survey.
Right.
So we're talking about actually identifying a particular site of historical or archaeological interest. Once we have identified that site, we have to get permission from the nation that we're working in. We have to work with their authorities. We have to work sometimes with their universities, their professors, if we're visiting from the United States or from some other country. So it's a lot of political things that are involved in it as well. What I mean is the bureaucracy of trying to go excavate at a particular place. But I think that's the nature of the question. But there are ways to get around if a site is difficult to reach or difficult to go in, we can actually survey it. But there's nothing like actually getting in the ground and going down and excavating through the different stratum to see what's there, because that's what archaeology is. Archaeology is like a destructive science. So once you get it out of the ground, then it's gone forever. So we're going to be very careful to record what we find in its original context. That's the key. That's what makes archaeology different than like treasure hunting or grave robbing, is that you can go get it out of the ground, but like Indiana Jones, so that's why he's a horrible archaeologist, because he doesn't record where he got it. One of the other things that I've actually used years ago when I was doing a survey through a national forest here in the United States is we use a GPS thing called a UTM, which stands for Universal Transverse Mercator Coordinate. Big name. All it is basically if you have your phone and you drop a pin on the Google Maps, and it records your latitude and longitude of exactly where you found that artifact.
Right.
So there's all kinds of technological cool things that you can do to find certain areas and to record what's been discovered there.
Yeah, and when I was reading up the book Reasonable Faith by Dr. William Lane Craig, in that he mentions about how certain people are very resistant to history, and say the history is subjective, you can't know anything really from the past and all of that. So there's one thought that came to my mind, is that when we look at like you dig around and you find a coin and it has inscription of a particular king, and therefore that adds to a knowledge by saying that such a king was in power during this era, and we date the coin to find out which era it was in and all of that. But what if we come across some sort of artifact that does not stand, how do I put, that does not stand as a proper historical element, but maybe someone made it and halfway through they discarded it. So it cannot be taken to be representing the real historical data or to be really recording an historical event. But we don't know. We just dig up and we find it.
Right.
How do we go around discerning that this is something that actually records proper historical data and not someone? I would say maybe saying someone making a fake artifact would be too much of a stretch to go and say that someone would go to the trouble to do that. But maybe some sort of an artifact that was like discarded halfway in, maybe a pillar that was discarded halfway in has an inscription. Maybe that even did not take place. Halfway in, they discarded the project. But we come up on that inscription, we think, oh, here's a pillar with an inscription, so therefore this event must have taken place. Is that a question that archaeologists ponder about, or is that something that I'm just going on?
Sure, yeah, it is, Jacob. And we call that in archaeology a non-provenance. I think is what you're talking about. We call it a non-provenance artifact. So it's an artifact that's been taken out of its original historical context. And it has historical value to it, but there's no way for archaeologists to, in other words, we won't put all of our eggs in that particular artifact basket because it's mysterious as to exactly where it comes from. It could have some interesting, and we know that it very likely is very ancient, and it very likely is probably accurate. It's just that we'll look at it in the broader context of the other archaeology in that area. I'll give you a couple of examples. So, for instance, in all throughout Egypt and all throughout the Near East, you find these little Egyptian scarabs. These are amulets that were used very extensively in Egypt. Well, there's now a database of amulets of these scarabs and to when they actually, the reigns of the different pharaohs.
Right.
So let's just say you have a hiker and he finds a scarab that he was hiking and he took it out of the ground, put it in his pocket, and then gave it to the Israeli Antiquities Authority. Well, we know it's ancient and we know it very likely, but there's just we don't know where it comes from. I was hiking in the the desert, in the Judean desert, and I found it. Well, we don't know. We do know it's important archaeologically, but we don't. Other than that, you really can't say much more about it. That's not to say that non-provenance artifacts cannot have a very powerful impact, because one of the most famous non-provenance artifacts is the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right.
The original Dead Sea Scrolls were taken out of the original context by Bedouins there in around the banks of the Dead Sea, and they actually took them. Interestingly, when they found them, because they're made out of animal hides and parchment, they're leather. The Bedouin took it to, I believe it was in Amman, Jordan, and they were going to sell it to a cobbler that makes shoes because it's leather, And I was like, no, don't do that. But anyway, this guy named Sukenik actually recognized these. This was the father of a very famous Israeli archaeologist by the name of Yigael Yadin, and Sukenik recognized that these scrolls were very, very important, and eventually went back to the Dead Sea and discovered more caves and more scrolls, and then it just opened up a whole nother thing. So that's not to say that a non-provenance artifact, an artifact that somebody finds that's sort of taken out of the context, can't have a very, very powerful effect on archaeology, because it can. It's just that this comes down to the main point that I think maybe you're trying to get at, but if you're not, I want to just make this clear, and that is that archaeology is not 100% science. In other words, you're not going to get 100% certainty with archaeology. You get degrees of probability. So there are some things that are more probable than others. It's more of a cumulative case. You build your case in archaeology, and there are some things that have a very strong case, and there are some things that don't have such a strongest case. But overall, I think when you look at from Old Testament to the New Testament, the Bible is very reliable archaeologically. And I would say that the majority of discoveries that have been made through the years have been made by people not setting out to prove the Bible, to make the Bible like, hey, here's an evidence of the Bible. These are found by people. They're just doing archaeology. Right. And as it turns out, their discoveries actually do show that the Bible is reliable. Hugo Winkler discovering the Hittites in 1909, the British and the French digging in Iraq, finding the city of Nineveh mentioned in the Old Testament. The city of Babylon, built by Nebuchadnezzar the Great, was excavated in the 19th century by the British. So these are all discoveries made by people not necessarily setting out to prove the Bible, but their discoveries laid the foundation for modern biblical archaeology. And there's just dozens of these. The discovery of the what was it back in the it was the Pontius Pilate inscription.
Right.
There was an inscription found with the name of Pontius Pilate on it. So there are many of these that are been discovered that actually show the Bible is reliable historically and archaeologically, which I think is again, that's the whole function of archaeology, is it's a cumulative case.
Yeah, I know the next question is going to be a bit of an overshoot maybe, but looking at the past 100 years of the 20th century, as an archaeologist, as a biblical archaeologist, which archaeological discovery would you say was sort of groundbreaking or shattering to archaeologists to say, wow, this part of Bible is in fact true? Is there any one that you would immediately pick off the top of your mind?
Let me just say a recent one. It was from a podcast that I did. When I read about this years ago, I actually thought it, and then I was confirmed by my friend, Dr. Jody Magnus at UNC Chapel Hill. She's an archaeologist at UNC Chapel Hill, and it was discovery of King Herod's coffin. King Herod in the book of in the New Testament, which figures very largely in the story, the birth narratives of Christ. his coffin was actually discovered. His mortuary temple, or mortuary little place where he was buried at Herodium, was discovered by an Israeli archaeologist named Ehud Netzer in I believe it was 2007. And Dr. Jody Magnus said that this is the most important archaeological discovery in Palestine since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I think she's right. So that's one. We have the coffin of King Herod. The other one that really stands out is, and it's been found several years ago, is the ossuary, or the bone box of Caiaphas. This is the high priest that presided over the trial of Christ. And so not only did we find his ossuary, we found his bones in the ossuary. So we have a character from the New Testament, from, well, two characters, one from the birth of Christ, Herod the Great, and we have one from the in the crucifixion narrative, or the trial of Christ, Caiaphas. We have his bones and his coffin. So these are two that really stand out to me. There are many others, and as I said, archaeology is a cumulative case, so it's hard to pinpoint one exact artifact. But those two stand out as quite remarkable, I think.
Yeah. And you would pin them as remarkable because these are highly referenced individuals in the New Testament gospel account of the life of Jesus, and therefore it's pretty important to find that they are actually recorded. But when I was digging through some of the archaeological discoveries, the ossuary of Johanan, the first century individual who was, has a nail in his foot and was crossfed, that seems to be, like, maybe it's because I look in the perspective of making a cumulative case for the resurrection, that seems to be very phenomenal. Can you touch upon that, on what was phenomenal about that discovery?
Absolutely. So so what you're talking about, so let's go back to the ossuary. An ossuary is a typically made out of limestone box. That's about 3 feet long or so. And in Second Temple, what archaeologists call Second Temple Judaism, so we're talking about 200 to 300 BC all the way up to about 70 AD, the Jews in Palestine, whenever they buried their dead, they would basically place them in a grave. The body would decay. They would place the bones in these ossuaries. And so, as I mentioned before, archaeologists have discovered the ossuary of Caiaphas, the high priest that presided over the trial of Christ. And then they also discovered, they found many of these, and one of them was Johanan, and it contained a heel bone of an individual that had been crucified. There was a Roman nail in the heel bone. And the significance of this, Jacob, and I think you're right about this, it is quite remarkable, is that what it shows us is that in the first century in Jerusalem, you have Romans crucifying individuals. Now, and again, we're not sure exactly why he was crucified, but the fact of the matter is he was crucified, and crucifixion was a common thing that the Romans did. We also read about this not only through the archaeological record, but also in the historical record as well, because Josephus has an account of the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And when the Romans came in, they killed many thousands of Jews and crucified them along the streets of Jerusalem and going into Jerusalem. So the historical record and the archaeological record match very, very well. And so the Johanan heel bone with the nail in it is really awesome, because what it shows us is that crucifixion absolutely did happen at that time.
And also it goes on to show that, contrary to skeptical claims, that the bodies of crucified victims were actually taken off cross and not just thrown into a mass grave, but were kept identifiable and separate, because most of you here say that there is no way Jesus' body could have been kept in a tomb because it must have been discarded. So that is like a slap in the face for people like Bart Ehrman, if I may say. And
that's right.
So about a couple of months back, I came into conversation with one of my friends, and he made this very startling claim that almost left me aghast. Like, how could he possibly make that claim? He said that the place Nazareth is a made-up place. I mean, that is that sort of like the Jesus myth of biblical archaeology, to say so? I mean, why do people even come up with such a claim?
It's a mystery. I don't know. I think there are a lot of people who, here's the thing, archaeology, for whatever reason, and again, I'm indicting myself on this, but it attracts some very colorful individuals. And I mean, you have all kinds of harebrained theories. I've heard it all. Aliens, and they built the pyramids, and there's all kinds of crazy harebrained ideas, but a lot of people will sort of dabble in it. and they don't really have a knowledge of that. But no credible historian or archaeologist doubts that Nazareth existed. We've found recently there have been, well, a lot of things are actually covered up. So the fact of the matter is that evidence of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But the fact of the matter is that that Nazareth did exist, and it existed in the first century, exactly as the scripture says. So, but there are a lot of places in Israel and the Near East that have not been excavated yet because there's just not enough time or people to excavate. But there was right off the top of my head, there was a piece of pottery that was inscribed. One of the ostraka that I mentioned, this is a piece of pottery with writing on it, and it contains some of the names in first century Palestine, and Nazareth was one of the names. So, so not only have we found archaeological evidence for Nazareth, but also historical inscriptional evidence for Nazareth as well. But yeah, it's sort of a Jesus mythicism thing. Someone might hear this, and then they gets passed on, and then they sort of use that as sort of an argument to say, I mean, it's pretty sad because there have been so many other things that have been discovered. You know, they kind of pull that out of the hat and go, hey, well, Nazareth has been discovered. But yes, it has been discovered, and but yeah, it's just not a huge site. And you would expect it to be. It's not like Jerusalem or Athens or Rome. It's a small village, so you're not going to find a ton of evidence for it.
Yeah, and maybe there's something going on in the background in the archaeological academies. Is there some sort of excavation that's happening right now that you think could be the next breakthrough? Maybe in the field of archaeology, maybe not strictly biblical archaeology. Is there something of that sort that you can hint us with? There's something happening of that sort.
Yeah, well, a couple actually. The two that I mentioned actually, Shiloh, our team at ABR. This is going to now. In 2014, I was in Israel with them and was assistant square supervisor at Kirbet El Makader, which is we believe the biblical site of Ai that was destroyed by Joshua and the Israelites. When you read carefully the Joshua narratives in the Old Testament, there are only 3 cities that the Bible states were definitively burned, and it was Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. And we've discovered all 3 of those cities archaeologically. They've been excavated. The debate today is over the dating of Jericho that goes all the way back to Kathleen Kenyon. She redated City 4 Jericho, and that's a whole other thing. But so this will complete the picture at Shiloh. This is the next step. They go to Shiloh and they establish the capital of Israel. They do the tribal allotment there. And our team has discovered so far some really cool things. And one of them is the animal bone middens. These are basically piles of bones that would have been sacrificial animals in the tabernacle. So we're still going down and excavating also storage rooms, because if this was the tabernacle, when you read the Old Testament, the Jewish people would bring their sacrifices and their grain to the place to offer to the Lord. So this is completing the picture that we're seeing, that the Exodus happened in the early date 1446, and then the conquest happened beginning in 1406, and then going all the way into the let's say 1401, 1399-ish was Hatzor. But so it shows us that the Old Testament account of the Exodus and conquest were accurate, historically accurate. So that's one of them. And then the survey that we're doing in Turkey, I got to say, well, we're going to explore one of the most famous, and I'll give you a big teaser hint here. We're going to explore one of the most famous events in the Old Testament that the world has ever seen. And it's one of the oldest stories in the world, the story of the flood. So you can kind of draw your own conclusions as to exactly what we're going to be doing. But we're going to be Eastern Turkey near Mount Ararat is all I can say.
Okay. All right. I was just thinking about 2 more points to ask you before we wrap up it, but you have just talked about the arc. So I'm just going to keep it at there. And before we wrap up, this is another fan favorite topic. I mean, this is something that people fascinate over. This is something that Gary Habermas has talked a lot about, the Shroud of Turin. And there is a lot of speculation around it. Gary Habermas, I think if I recall right, he said he's about 85% sure that this is actually the burial cloth of Jesus. So, but still there are a lot of speculations around. Now, we just have a few minutes before us. So can you give a quick overview on what is happening in the academic side of this discussion? Is there any new breakthroughs coming around, or is that still same old speculations and debates?
I think, okay, so quickly, and I'm familiar with Gary's work on this. He actually stayed at my house years ago. He missed a flight, and we actually went down to my library in my own study, and I had a book on the Shroud, and I asked Gary about it. It was a book by Ian Wilson called The Blood of the Shroud. And so years ago, I had the blessing of being with Gary in my own house to talk about the Shroud of Turin, and have since talked to him about this extensively. And I've read stuff he's did on it. I did at the National Apologetics Conference, I did a seminar like thing with him and then other archaeologists on this. But what Gary says, and I'm just going to repeat what he says, is that what they do is they eliminate what it's not. It's not a painting.
Right.
It can't be produced by technological means that we have today, and the only explanation are intense radiation. And there are two kinds of radiation that could form this kind of image, and it would be gamma ray and X-ray radiation. So again, it is a non-provenance artifact, and the fact that it sort of appears in the historical record of about the 14th century in a church in northern Italy, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have historical significance, because it really very much could. And I'm with Gary on this. I tend to lean toward the fact that it may be authentic. It's just there's no way to know with 100% certainty. Again, archaeology is not 100% certain, but you rule out what it could not be. But there are just so many things that just can't be explained as just mere coincidence. And one of the things that Gary told me years ago, I don't know if you've had him on or talked about this, there are so many things, but two that really were impressed to me was the sequence of the image. So you can't even see it with a naked eye. You can only see it through a negative, so a photographic negative. So if you look at the shroud, the face of Christ, if you were to just hold the shroud up, you really couldn't see it because it's so light. You have to actually put it through a negative photographic negative to see it. But it's the sequence of the images. So there's blood on the shroud, and then there's the image of the face and the body on the shroud. But this is the sequence. The sequence was that the blood came first and then the image, which is really cool. I mean, because if the body was wrapped quickly after the death on the cross, because they had to get him down off the cross and wrap the body, and they didn't have time to get the wounds, the blood off the wounds, because that's what the women were going to do when they came to the empty tomb. They were going to clean the body because it was wrapped up. So the blood was given, and then the image came through. So that is really interesting to me. And then Gary was sharing with me about this when I was actually going to be on the History Channel. No, it was on CNN. They contacted me to interview me on the Shroud, and I actually emailed Gary, and I was like, "Hey, man, you should be on this." And he said, "No, Ted, you should do it." So he told me to read a book by a scholar by the name of Frederick Zugby called The Crucifixion of Jesus, and I would recommend that to your listeners if they want to read an account of the physiological, historical account of what crucifixion was like, and how it would actually how it would actually affect a human body. Then they should read the account. It's called The Crucifixion of Jesus by Frederick Zugby, and it is quite remarkable. And Zugby actually gets into the image on the shroud and talks about this image is very consistent with what we see of a human body in the early state of rigor mortis after it had died. So it's pretty amazing, and I lean towards that it could be authentic. But again, even if we didn't have the shroud, Jacob, I think a case can be made very strongly historically that the New Testament is historically reliable, and that it gives us an accurate account of the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus.
I mean, with each passing discovery, the veracity of the Bible is affirmed day by day. I mean, that the change of the Oxford historian William Ramsay, Sir William Ramsay itself, where he comes along and says Luke is a historian of the highest rank itself, is a testimony to the veracity. And thank you so much, Ted, for being on the podcast. It was an absolute pleasure to get to dialogue with you and to hear these insightful intakes on what's happening with biblical archaeology.
Well, thank you, Jacob. Thank you for having me on.
And I hope that you had also a great time. And thank you for audience for tuning in. Stick around for the next podcast that comes along, and we'll catch you in the next one. God bless and take care.